This is Yvonne Drakeley. I am the Disability Specialist Careers and Employment Advisor for Lancaster University. And today I'm going to take you through a presentation on declaring a disability, mental health or long-term health condition to potential employers. And you will notice on the slide, there is a second part to this title, which is your choices. And I want to make sure that right up front, you're aware that there is no fixed way that this must or should be done. Every individual makes their own decisions about how to approach this in terms of whether to, what to declare, when to declare, what level of discussion to engage with people. And the purpose of this presentation is to make you aware of the issues and also to give you sources of further information and advice should you feel you need them. What I've tried to do in creating this presentation is summarise all the key information and understandings that I've gained from dealing with employers, also advice and information I've had from disability advocacy organisations, and also incorporate some things I've learned from supporting Lancaster students with disabilities who have applied for opportunities and declared disability and what their experiences have been. So I've tried to cover all the things that I think somebody might need to know. And of course, that means that there's a lot of information and a lot of issues covered here. And it's likely that at various points, things will be raised that you may feel you need to go away and research a little bit more, or you need to think about. Now, this is a long presentation. It lasts over an hour. And so I would suggest when you reach a point where there's something that you feel you need to consider, pause the presentation and come back to it when you're ready. I think if you go all the way through it in an hour without a break, you may find that something that was important to you might have got lost because of things that happen later. So that would be my suggestion. Also, if issues are raised where you feel that you could do with some information and advice, please be aware that in the later stages of the presentation, there are links and contact details, both to get in touch with me and for other organisations as well. So let's have a look at what's going to be covered today. First of all, I've included, because I think it's important if you do have a disability to be aware of the protections that you have under the 2010 Equality Act. So there is information on the legal situation and what counts as a disability. I'm not going to cover that in huge detail, but the information is there for your reference. What I will cover in more detail are the factors that you might want to consider in relation to declaring a disability to a potential employer, in terms of why do it, when's the best time, what does an employer actually need to know, and how to make sure your presentation gets to the right people. And this is all framed in relation to employment, recruitment and selection processes, as is the focus of this presentation. So let's start with the legal situation arising from the Equality Act 2010 and the provisions it makes for disability. The statement that you'll see on the screen is the official summary of the protections under the Act. I have highlighted in bold the key phrases for you to be aware of. So firstly, there is that a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial or long-term adverse effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities constitutes a disability under the Equality Act, and therefore you are protected against discrimination in a whole range of settings, including work and applying for work. And another very important secondary element is that a whole range of providers of services and also employers are required to make reasonable adjustments and provide support so that you can access services and opportunities, that includes job opportunities, on the same basis as someone who does not have a disability. So a lot of this presentation is about reasonable adjustments in the recruitment and selection process. But just to explore the legal situation and the Equality Act 2010 in a little bit more detail, you may be wondering whether your condition does count as a disability. So here is a list of what counts as a physical or mental impairment, and you will see that it's pretty wide ranging and doesn't just cover things which are traditionally considered disabilities, but also mental health conditions, where a whole series of symptoms accumulate to make you disabled, and also hidden disabilities as well. Substantial and adverse effect means something that's more than a minor or trivial difficulty and goes beyond the normal differences in ability which exist between people. And long-term effect, this is often something that people recently diagnosed or who have never considered themselves to have a disability need to think about. And the key thing is that it needs to be of 12 months or more duration. Either it's already lasting more than 12 months, or you've been advised with something that you've been diagnosed with that it is going to last for at least 12 months or maybe a lifelong condition. And also things that maybe you have been very disabled by a condition in the past which is variable and you're well now, but it's a lifelong or a long-term condition, and it's likely that at points in the future you may well suffer disabling symptoms again. Normal day-to-day activities includes pretty much everything that you do on a normal day-to-day basis, but for the purposes of this presentation, be aware that both studying and working and applying for jobs are normal day-to-day activities and are therefore covered by the Equality Act and give you protections against discrimination and rights to reasonable adjustments in these processes. Okay, so that was your legal rights. Now, there is often confusion with the disability confident employers interview guarantee. Any of you who have applied for opportunities or maybe heard or read about disability rights may have come across reference to the employers interview guarantee scheme. Now, this is a voluntary scheme. It's government backed and very much promoted by the government to employers. And what it says is that if somebody with a disability applies for a job opportunity and meets the essential requirements for the job, then they will automatically be offered an interview. That does not mean they will get the job. Once they get to interview, they will be assessed on the same basis as other candidates, but it does offer the opportunity to go past the first sift that employers often do when they get a lot of applications and be fast-tracked to interview stage. You will still hear this scheme referred to by 2 ticks, which refers back to when the Disability Confident programme had a different logo which consisted of 2 ticks. You'll see on the bottom right of the screen there is the current Disability Confident logo, and 2 ticks is included in there along with 3 other icons. So if you hear about the 2 ticks scheme, it's talking about the Disability Confident Employers Interview Guarantee, and that is optional, as we'll see as we get into the presentation. Some of the employers who are part of this scheme ask you if you, as a disabled applicant, want to be considered on the interview guarantee scheme, and that's one of the choices that you've got. Okay, so I've talked here about the legal situation. I've talked about a government-backed scheme to encourage opportunities for people with disabilities, but let's have a look at, from your perspective, from the applicant's perspective, what does all this mean for you? And the first thing to say is that you're not obliged to declare that you have a disability to potential employers. So you have protections, but you do not have obligations here. But the legal duties that we've talked about that employers have to ensure applicants are not disadvantaged on the basis of their disability, and furthermore, employers must provide reasonable adjustments in their recruitment and selection processes to ensure that all applicants are able to compete on equal terms. Those only apply if you have declared that disability to an employer at the initial stage. If you don't declare, it can't work retrospectively, as in if you go through a recruitment selection process that presented you with some additional challenges and difficulties because of the nature of your condition, you cannot subsequently, if you are not offered opportunity, go back and say, yes, but it wasn't fair because I have this disability that makes this thing difficult, and so I didn't show you my true potential. All this is on offer provided you declare that you have a disability. I think also what I need to tell you, and this has come through loud and clear from individual employers and from organisation representing employers generally, but very much so graduate employers, they're not just interested in discharging their legal obligations, they're very keen to find the best talent for their opportunities. A lot of them have a very genuine commitment to promoting equality, diversity, inclusion, and to having a diverse workforce that includes people who've got a lot to offer and also live with a disability. And they also want to make sure that they ensure the health and safety of people they deal with, not just their employees, but also applicants for their opportunities. And therefore, a lot of them do go the extra distance to commit to various schemes and groups and sources of information and advice relating to employing a more diverse workforce. I've already mentioned Disability Confident, and you will see that the logo for Disability Confident is below. Another one that's specifically relevant to people with mental health difficulties is the Mindful Employer programme. And also there's the Business Disability Forum, which is a much broader based coalition of employers and organisations who are committed to making sure that their talent pool includes people with disabilities. If you see that a potential employee you're applying to has got one or more of these logos on their recruitment material, then that can give you some assurance that this is an employer who's got a greater level of awareness and consideration of disability issues, and therefore you can feel confident that your application will be supported with reasonable adjustments, and that if you go through to be an employee of that organisation, that they are going to be sympathetic and open-minded to issues and concerns around being an employee with a disability. So here are the benefits to you of being open. First of all, if you are open about your disability, and therefore the employer has to consider making adjustments to their recruitment processes, these should allow you to show your full potential. Also, if you have declared, then you are in control of perceptions of your disability. You decide what you're going to declare and how you're going to describe the difficulties you have, which means that it's not about them noticing things or having concerns about how you've performed. It is about you being upfront and things being talked about in the terms that you want them to be talked about. And in doing that, what you're doing is creating an opportunity to talk about the strengths and competencies that you will have evidenced through achieving to the level of education that you will have done as a Lancaster student while living with a disability. There are a whole range of these to do with persistence, determination, resourcefulness, often time management as well, which are employability qualities that employers are always interested in, regardless of the sector. Also, in declaring and being ready to negotiate adjustments in the recruitment and selection processes, what you're demonstrating is that you're proactive and that you're prepared to be cooperative in your approach, you know, to enter into dialogue and consider what is a reasonable adjustment that you might need and be able to articulate that. And again, these are very valuable employability attributes that will be of interest to employers in a wide range, well, in fact, in all employment sectors and roles. Now, I'm going to be going into detail about the recruitment and selection processes that are typical for graduate opportunities. And just for those of you who've maybe not had opportunity to explore these and to be clear about what's involved, I've listed the main stages that you might expect to encounter. Not everyone applies to every opportunity, but these are common patterns. You've got the initial application and registration, which is usually mostly key demographic and contact information. Then there's the more detailed information that employers need to decide whether you're a good match for the opportunities they're offering. Some employers will ask for that in the form of a CV and or a covering letter. Some will ask for personal statement. Some will ask for competency-based answers. There's also often for graduate and professional level opportunities an element of testing of your capabilities and your aptitudes. Some employers offer assessment centres where you visit their premises, or sometimes they're hosted on campus, and they can include individual and group tasks. And then there's interviews. Those might be video based, they might be phone based, they might be face to face. If you're not too sure about any of these and what they mean, I would encourage you to click on the link at the bottom of the slide to the CVs, applications and interview page of the careers website, which will give you more information and detail on what each of these steps actually means. So if you're looking at declaring your disability to an employer, there are various points in the application and recruitment process where you might do this. And in the next 3 slides, I'm going to take you through the stages at which you might choose to do it, how advisable it is to do it at that stage. And finally, the 3rd slide does give far more detail about the reasons for that, again, based on things that I've been told by employers and that feedback that students have had when they have declared disabilities. So here's the main stages. You might decide to get in contact with an employer, declare your disability before you apply. You might need to declare on the application form. There's also, if they do ask for a covering letter, that there's an opportunity there, as is on your CV if they're asking for CVs. Then if things move to the next stage and you're invited for an interview or an assessment centre, that's another opportunity to declare, followed by the start of the assessment centre or interview. And then finally, assuming and hoping that you have negotiated and performed well at all the previous stages, there is declaring when you are offered the role. So let's move on to look at how advisable this is at each stage. And what I've done is categorised from the stages where it's a good idea, the stages where it depends on the context, and then the stages where it's not a good idea. So let's start with where it's not a good idea, and that is waiting until you have been invited for an assessment centre or interview, have arrived on the day, have your first contact with the recruitment staff for the organisation, and to declare it at that point. That, if it's the first time they've heard about your disability and the fact that you might need reasonable adjustments, that can be quite problematic and very often not to your advantage. So I would say do not wait until then to declare a disability. The times when it is a good idea are on the application form, and I'll say more about that later, but the earlier the better, most employers advise us. If it is a process where they're asking for a covering letter and a CV, making reference to having a disability and what that might be is advisable in your covering letter. If you reach the stage where you're invited, so they've contacted you to tell you where and when to be for an assessment centre or interview, which means that you've been accepted and you're now in the full recruitment and selection process, that's a really good point if you haven't done it before. And then should you navigate all your way through the recruitment and selection process and be offered, then that's a good time to again declare, regardless of whether you already have or not, because as we'll discover at the later stages of this presentation, there are issues to consider about reasonable adjustments for somebody who's an employee in a workplace that might not be relevant when they are an applicant going through a recruitment process. So here on this slide, I give the reasons. It's still the same stages, saying there's still advice on whether to do it or not, but now we're going into the reasons. And here I'll explain and focus on why I have said before you apply and on your CV, depend on context. The reason that I've said before you apply depends is that it is a really good idea to find out in advance the exact nature of the job and what's going to be involved in the application process, which generally means contacting an employer and explaining why you're asking these questions. And it may well be that they enter into a very helpful dialogue with you at that stage about reasonable adjustments they can offer in the recruitment and selection process, and also were you to be an employee. But if you do that, bear in mind that you will still need to record it on your application and in the application and recruitment process. I've known students who've had very useful discussions with employers before they've applied and then have assumed that that's been recorded somewhere and will be linked with their name when they make an application. And that hasn't always happened. So it is important that it is on your initial application. The other place I've said depends is on your CV. And this is because the key fact about CVs is that every item on your CV should be relevant to the job opportunity and the employer and should be showcasing your potential. And the question to ask yourself is, does mentioning your disability here meet those criteria? In some cases, it clearly does. Somebody who has had a lifelong mobility or sensory impairment and who has gone on to challenge themselves and get involved in activities that wouldn't be considered easy for a person with that condition may well want to mention it in their CV because it really does showcase their determination, their refusal to be limited, their resourcefulness at finding ways to participate in activities and opportunities that might have been challenging because of their condition. Also, for people who've got lifelong conditions, it can be part of your identity and who you are, and part of what a CV is about is giving them a sense of the person that you are as well as your potential. And so it may be very relevant. For other conditions that maybe have been diagnosed or acquired later in life and where maybe they don't present quite so many challenges, then it may not really be use of space in your CV to mention it at that point. There may be more important things to say about yourself that an employer might want to know. So moving on to what to declare. I mean, you know your condition and what it means for you. What does an employer need to know in the recruitment and selection process? And that may not be everything about your condition. And as I've said here, at the recruitment and selection stages, they don't need to know details of your diagnoses, medical terms, prognoses. They don't need to see really detailed information. You don't need to provide medical evidence at the recruitment stage. You'll be aware that in registering as having a disability with the university, you will have had to provide evidence. That's because at that stage you were an enrolled student and they were looking at the reasonable adjustments in your education that would be needed to enable you to access on equal grounds. Recruitment and selection is an earlier stage and that isn't needed. It should be acceptable that you state that you have a condition. You don't even need to name it. You just name what the issues are arising that are going to be challenging for you in recruitment and selection and may need adjustments. Now, occasionally employers, if the reasonable adjustment is something that they're going to have to go to time and trouble to organise for you and there may be cost involved, they may ask you to provide evidence. You're not obliged to, but equally if you want to appear cooperative, you may feel that you want to provide something. And really all that you need to provide in the way of evidence at this stage is something that confirms that you do actually have a diagnosed disability of some sort. And the university's disability service can provide a letter that confirms that you are registered and recognised as having a disability with the university and that you have an inclusive learning support plan. And that should be enough evidence for an employer. Of course, if you feel you want to provide them with much more detailed information, that is your right, but be aware that the person reading this may not be a specialist in disability in the workplace and may struggle to figure out from what you're sending them what reasonable adjustments they could offer. So really your focus should be on the difficulties you expect you may have in specific contexts of recruitment and selection, and therefore what adjustments you might need to enable you to show your potential in those activities, rather than providing them with a huge amount of information and diagnoses and reports and assessments and so forth. That's more than an employer needs to know at this stage. So you are going to need to work out what adjustments you need. Employers can't always know, and indeed because each person with a disability, even two people with the same diagnosed disability, are individuals with different needs and difficulties, it's important you become the expert on figuring out what adjustments you need. And here's some ways that you can increase your expertise. First of all, there's research on the organisation that you're applying to and the opportunity that you are particularly interested in and what recruitment procedures you're going to go through. So you've got a clear picture of what challenges may lie ahead of you, and then link that with your condition and how it may give you additional challenges beyond other applicants in assessment and selection processes. Sometimes reports, assessments and professional advice you've had in educational settings or through diagnosis and treatment you might have had may contain recommendations. Also, if you have a support tutor or attend a clinic, people there may also be able to offer advice and recommendations on what might be difficult for you. The other thing is to kind of reflect. You will already have had experiences of applications, interviews, of study, of potentially being in workplaces. So you can think about, well, what was harder for me than for other people, and what things helped me get through that. These can be very valuable clues, including things that are on your individual learning support plan, discussions you've had with academic staff and with the disability service at the university. Also, don't discount extracurricular stuff you've done. You know, if you've got involved in things through your course, your department, through the students' union, societies, volunteering, these are all extra evidence and some reflection on where you've found challenges and how they were overcome can provide very valuable information. But I do accept that recruitment and selection processes are very distinct activities and you may not have been involved. If you're really unsure, you can actually have a mock experience of online testing, of interviews and of assessment centres through university careers. This is one of the things we regularly offer. So again, if you go back to the page I mentioned before, the applications, interviews and CV page, not only will it give you a better idea of what to expect, but also on that page you can find out about opportunities to experience mock interviews and other stages of the application process. So I would recommend doing that if you've not experienced any of this before. So now I'm going to move on to examples of reasonable adjustments processes, and I've broken it down into those stages that I mentioned before in the previous slide. So tests, whether they're online or actually on an employer's premises as part of an assessment centre, there are various adjustments that are considered reasonable here. Alternative formats, you know, if a screen-based assessment is difficult for you to access, can you have it paper-based? There are, of course, all the different adjustments that can be made to paper colour, font size, layout, and so forth to make tests accessible. Also, if it is an assessment centre, your condition may mean that certain times of the day are better for you than others. Most employers will offer extra time, usually initially 25%, almost as a matter of course on tests. But if that's all they offer, don't feel that that's the only adjustment they can make. You are fully entitled to request other sorts of adjustments. Going back to tests that are done in a place at a certain time, you might want to, as you may have done in exam conditions, ask for a quiet room, a particular position in a room, particular lighting arrangements, and also to have instructions either verbally, printed, or both, depending on what will best allow you to be aware of what the requirements of the test are. Moving on to interviews. Again, there are a whole range of modified arrangements that can be offered, particularly with video interviews that tend to come early on in the recruitment process. If those are very difficult for you, or the time that you get is difficult because of processing delays, then do contact the employer to discuss other ways that they can do the assessments that they need to do through a video interview. Also, if it's a face-to-face interview, you can ask for particular times of day. And then also, if you do have processing delays or social and communication difficulties related to your disability, it is possible to have the questions in written format, so that if just hearing it verbally is going to be a difficulty, also have them reinforced in written form. And also, some employers are prepared to consider giving you the questions before you start the interview, not well in advance, so that you can ask everybody you know what you ought to say and come up with some model answer, because that's giving you an advantage. And this isn't about giving disabled people advantages. This is about making sure that they can perform on an equal level with everybody else. So they might give you the questions on the day in advance, maybe half an hour before. They may also be prepared to let you bring notes into the interview, either of things that you've seen the questions in advance, or maybe you know that it's going to be a competence-based interview, and therefore you need to be able to talk through instances where you've demonstrated competencies, but you know that it's unlikely that that will come to mind in the interview. You might take notes in that just remind you of particularly important things you've done that you would want to talk about. And also, if you do have social and communication or processing difficulties, extra time to consider answers, so that they know up front that when they ask you the question and maybe give it you in printed format, you're going to need a bit more time to formulate your answer before you speak, is an entirely reasonable adjustment if it is part of the difficulties that your particular condition can lead to. So moving on to the second slide about examples of reasonable adjustments. If you do get invited for an assessment day, which most people find these quite challenging and tiring, and there may be challenges arising from your disability and condition that are going to make them harder still. Some people would find it very difficult to arrive in a place they've never been before and immediately be involved in activities that are going to stretch and test them. It is possible to have orientation visits, either to arrive early or beforehand, where you just visit the premises, get a sense of where it is, where you're going to be, and possibly access to certain facilities that you might need. Also in advance, it's a reasonable adjustment that can be considered that you're given clear information about the activities and the schedule. This doesn't always happen. Sometimes they'll just tell you where and when to be, and that you can expect to be there until a certain time in the afternoon, but there's no clear information about when there'll be breaks, when lunch will be, whether there will be lunch, and that might be very relevant to your ability to perform, so you can ask for that. Regular breaks are needed for some people, and if there are going to be group as well as individual activities, so where you and a number of other candidates may be given a task to do, if that is going to be difficult, if there's going to be a number of groups in a room with a lot of noise, and your sensory difficulties mean that that's going to make it difficult for you to participate in the group and the activity you've been allocated to, and a reasonable adjustment that can be considered is your group going to a separate room. Also on assessment days, the ability to leave the assessment room briefly at appropriate moments, of course, having been agreed in advance, can be necessary for a whole range of difficulties and disabilities. And finally, buildings and equipment. There's a whole range of adjustments there, ranging from accessible facilities to giving consideration to movement around a building, whether to request that you are not moved around the building either because of mobility difficulties or because your condition leads to you getting disorientated very easily. And of course there's adapted furniture, assistive technology, and also support by a human being. You may need communication support, you may need an accompanier, and these are adjustments that are reasonable to ask an employer to consider if they are going to overcome challenges specific to your condition. Okay, so you may have reached the point now that you've heard and read all of this presentation so far and thought, do you know, this is such a lot of bother and my condition really doesn't give me that much trouble. I just don't think I'm going to bother with this. And that is a choice you've got, of course. You may say, right, I'm just going to go through it straight like any other candidate and sidestep all these complicated considerations and requests and discussions and so forth. But before you make that decision, just consider how you might be disadvantaging yourself. What you might be doing is actually making it harder. These recruitment and selection processes, they are intended to be hard for everybody. They challenge people, they stretch people, they test people, they get them outside their comfort zones. And if you were already, kind of working extra hard to compensate for a barrier that your condition imposes on you, then you're further disadvantaging yourself if you don't take advantage of getting adjustments and support. It also means the employers aren't assessing you on a fair basis. You may be working twice as hard to perform at the same level as another candidate, and that might not be your full potential. And if they do decide that you haven't demonstrated potential and you're not offered an opportunity, they've missed out on talent, and you have missed out on the chance to help them create a more diverse workforce, to bring your particular unique views and abilities, some of which will be related to living with a condition or a disability. That's not going to be in the workplace because you made it harder for yourself than it needed to be. And on the subject of making it harder for yourself than it needs to be, they are pretty stressful. Some of, particularly interviews and assessment centres, are pretty stressful. And if you are working extra hard to overcome an undeclared disability and try and compete with everybody else on an equal level, that's going to add to your stress levels, and it could potentially risk your health and well-being. It has been known for students with disabilities who've decided not to declare and who get through to assessment centres to put themselves through the experience, given like 110%. Everybody has to give 100%. They have to give the extra 10% to account for the extra challenges they're facing, and for them to be really quite unwell afterwards, to have just overstretched themselves. And you know, we really don't want that to be happening to you, and there's no reason that it should. But what I want to reinforce again is that late requests for adjustments can be problematic. So, you know, think this through at an early stage and decide your policy, because if you start into the recruitment and selection process, and then say, you know, you've decided not to declare, and then the day before an assessment centre you're thinking, oh Lord, you know, I've had a flare up of my condition, or I can tell that, you know, my levels of anxiety or whatever are going to be such that I'm not going to do well, so I'll tell them when I get there on the day. This can be disruptive, and it can also disadvantage you in the sense that they could be distracted. As I said in the earlier slide about why not to declare at the beginning of an interview, if you tell them for the first time on the day of an interview or an assessment centre that you have a disability, you need reasonable adjustments, they'll do their best to accommodate you. That might be problematic for you and them, and it's certainly going to be distraction for both parties, which means that some of what you've got to offer might somehow not get noticed because they're worrying, or maybe you forget to say something because there's been a lot of chopping and changing on the day while they've tried to arrange things for you, and it's all just got a bit confusing. So, you know, if you decide not to declare at the first stages, that's fair enough. If you change your mind and then decide at later stages, actually I do need to tell them now about this, that's fair enough, but do not leave it until the last minute to do. Try to declare in advance, and then everybody's got a bit more time and space to think things through, to decide what's for the best and to move forward on it. So this stage of the presentation is for those who think, well, actually, yes, I should declare my disability when I'm applying for opportunities. The first thing I need to say, and this has caught students out, and very understandably so, it's not any mistake on their part, is about the business about equal opportunities monitoring forms. Whenever you initially make an initial application or register for an opportunity, it's very likely that you will be asked to complete an equal opportunities monitoring form that asks about a number of your demographic features, you know, gender and ethnic background and so forth, and disability will be included. Do declare it on there, but just be aware that with a lot of employers, and particularly big employers with sophisticated HR procedures, those equal opportunities monitoring forms are never seen by the hiring managers or the recruitment team, because there's a deliberate gap to make sure that there cannot be any unconscious bias in the recruitment and selection process. So and which is fine for ethnicity and so forth, but it can lead to confusion with disability, that students think, well, I put it on the equal ops monitoring form, surely that feeds through to the recruitment team. I would say don't assume that's going to happen. You need to make sure you declare to the recruitment team. So because they are the people who are going to be able to offer the reasonable adjustments. So regardless of what you put on your equal opportunities monitoring form, at the appropriate stage in the recruitment process, do make sure you speak to the recruitment and selection staff, the hiring manager. The way employers want to engage in dialogue this and offer you the opportunity to declare disabilities can vary. One way is that it is part of the initial registration and application, other than the equal opportunities monitoring form, but it can also be a parallel process. I've got examples of this to explain what I mean in following slides, but at the same time that you're completing the standard application form, they may be inviting you by other means to speak to them directly or email them, contact them to talk about reasonable adjustments. And sometimes that can only kick in, you've done the initial registration application and then you're invited to the next stage of the recruitment process. Sometimes it can be at that stage. It should be at that stage at the very latest. And what I'd say is, if you're unclear, if you're not sure whether you've declared or not, whether you've spoken to the right people, then I would suggest contacting the employer through whatever with contact details they've given you, and specifically ask who's responsible for ensuring that there are reasonable adjustments for applicants with disabilities, and how you can speak to that person or team. As I say, you know, you've got a legal entitlement to this, so this is an entirely reasonable request to make of an employer, and it's worth checking and them saying, oh yes, we've got your details, yes, we're just putting together our thoughts on reasonable adjustments, we'll be back in touch. And you say, oh, that's great, I'll leave it with you and I'll wait to hear. Or maybe, well, when might I expect to hear? Rather do that than not contact them and then discover when you get to the stage of the recruitment process that they're first going to expect you to engage with, that they haven't made any reasonable adjustments. And this has happened with online tests, video interviews, and various things where students thought that they were going to get extra time or a modified arrangement because they had put some details somewhere else, and somehow that hasn't happened. You've got to remember, a lot of these employers, they're dealing with very large numbers of applicants, and they're usually under a great deal of pressure to get these processes moving, and sometimes, you know, systems and individuals can fail to match things up. So it's always best for you to keep a close eye on what's happening about reasonable adjustments. Just to offer some assurances about the information you provide, because of course it is sensitive information. Even if you've told them nothing about the nature of your condition, having to describe some of the barriers and difficulties it might give you in recruitment processes can be difficult to do. So let's just look at what the situation is. First of all, the equal opportunities monitoring form, usually that information will remain separate from recruitment and selection, and it will only have been passed on if you've specifically given permission. And that's why sometimes you need to make sure it's on your main application form, or that you have communicated with the recruitment team in some other way about the reasonable adjustments and the disability that leads to you asking for them. Now, if you have done that, that information should stay purely with the recruitment team for purposes of recruitment and selection, and it will only be passed on should you be offered the job with your permission. It's not unusual for the person who offers you the job, you know, usually phones or sometimes emails and says, you know, we're very pleased to offer you a place on our grad scheme or in this opportunity that you applied for, that they might ask you, is it okay if we pass on the information you've given us about your disability and the reasonable adjustments to the manager who's going to be supervising you when you start the job? And it's your right to say yes or no. I would strongly advise saying yes, and also following that up with a further conversation, because as you will see at the end of this presentation, there are going to be issues for many people and living with many disabilities about making sure they can perform at their best in the workplace. But what I would advise is that before that any of these conversations happen, you've thought through what you're happy and not happy to share and at what point, because it is your sensitive data and you have rights about that. So here we're moving on to the first of the examples about where and at what stage an employer is asking you to tell them if you've got disabilities and what reasonable adjustments you might need. And this is an example of one of the pages on an online application for an employer who has signed up to the Disability Confidence Scheme. As you will see in the bottom right of the page, there is the Disability Confident logo. And that means that they're asking you as part of your initial application whether you have disabilities and whether you want to take advantage of the guaranteed interview scheme. So you'll see that there's drop down boxes just for the general category of your disability, and get used to this. You will find this a lot, that at the initial stage you're not being asked for specific details, they just want a general sense. So I've put the drop down box there so you can see an example of what they put, though you will see there's also free text box on the page to say a little bit more detail. And then, whoops, I've got a bit ahead of myself, I'm going to go back one. You will see that they actually ask you whether you want, just below the drop downs, they're asking you whether you want to be part of the guaranteed interview scheme, whether you need reasonable adjustments, and to say something about that. So right at the beginning with this employer, you're being asked about it. Okay. Now, we also had this scenario where the initial application may not cover disability other than in the equal opportunities monitoring, but you've got employers who are very keen that you enter into separate dialogue with them. So here we've got an example of an inclusive employer who's encouraging applicants to contact them about adjustments. This is the Wellcome Trust, who are not-for-profit, large employer with a grad scheme that recruits every year. They've got a web page, adjustments for job applicants, a statement that no one should face barriers when applying for a job at Wellcome. We're keen to make sure our application process is accessible to everyone. Then they talk about making adjustments in the latter part. Making adjustments in the latter part, and they've got an email address to contact. And you could do that before application or once you've applied, and that's when it becomes a parallel process. So this is an example where at the same time as just having made a mainstream application, you can also start to speak to them direct, and it will match up the discussions you have via that email address with your application. Here's a third approach, and this is one where it all comes into play when you've made your initial application and they invite you to take the first stage of the process. So this is an email following initial application, and this is from Mott Macdonald, who are a large engineering and civil engineering recruiter every year. And the first part of the screen is the first part of the email. Thank you for applying. What they now need you to do: we now need you to complete an assessment provided by Cap & Co. A lot of large employers do outsource the initial online tests that they might ask you to do. Then there were various headings that told you more about the assessment questions before you start, if you need help, particularly with technical issues, and there was a lot of text beneath each of those. And then at the bottom of the email, in the same size font as the rest, I've enlarged it for ease of reading. They have this statement: if you have a disability and require adjustments to support you throughout this selection process, please contact us before you start the assessment. And it gives you an email address and it gives you a phone number. Now, I have to say that the student who forwarded this email on to me had missed that bit and had tried to start the assessment, had been given the 5 days to do it in, and realised that it was just not possible to do this because of issues around accessing and dealing with tests on screens, and have got themselves into quite a worried state about all this. And it was understandable, because when the email was forwarded on to me, it was a very long email. So I pass this on to you as a cautionary tale to always read these kind of notification emails to the end. You know, once you've got past the initial, oh wow, of being invited onto the next stage, do, you know, kind of when you're in a calm frame of mind, read the whole email really carefully, because at the very latest, this is the stage where they'll be inviting you to notify them of needing reasonable adjustments on grounds of disability. Okay, this is all complicated stuff, and each individual and each opportunity they're applying for can lead to different considerations in relation to declaring disability and what reasonable adjustments might be needed. A lot of my one-to-one work and my email exchanges with students asking for advice do relate to this topic, and you are very welcome to get further and advice support on an individualised basis. I've included on this slide both how you can book an appointment for a one-to-one meeting, and also how you can email me, and we have a 5-day turnaround on the emails. That's the university standard, but on the whole I will try to respond more quickly if other work commitments allow me to, and particularly if you've got a deadline and a really urgent concern. There's also a photograph of me there, so if you do come to meet me, you know who you're looking for, and you also know who's talking to you in this presentation. So that's what careers can do. Here's some other sources of information. You might want to click on these links. The university's careers website has a whole section on equality and diversity, which has a high number of resources for students with disabilities that click through to other sites and sources of information and advice, webinars. You can watch all sorts of things. So I'd recommend exploring that. There's also the My Plus Students Club, which is a not-for-profit organisation that is specifically concerned with supporting students with disabilities in accessing the postgraduate opportunities. And by that, I don't mean postgraduate courses, I mean after graduation opportunities in the job market that they're interested in. And there's a lot of really useful and detailed information on their website, including a lot of listings of employers who are particularly disability aware and are sympathetic to the challenges that students with disabilities face, both in the application and recruitment processes and also in settling into working life. So that is a very valuable site for you to look at. And then should you want to check out chapter and verse on disability rights, including those in employment and education, I've included a link to the online overview of disability rights on the gov.uk website. So there are lots of people and places you can go for advice and information. Now, I've included a final couple of slides here, which are working on the basis that as a high quality applicant who manages their engagement with recruitment and selection well and really demonstrates their potential, they've got every chance of being offered the opportunity at the end of this. And here I've included a couple of slides that relate to things you might need to think about when you're offered an employment opportunity. And this does include internships, placements, part-time opportunities, whatever. Because when you go into the workplace, the adjustments you need might be quite different and specific compared to not only what you needed in the recruitment selection process, but quite possibly what you have needed so far in your educational career at university and before, because working life and workplaces place different demands and have different expectations. So here's some I've listed for you to think about, and there isn't a huge amount of advice in this presentation, but just so you can be thinking about this, what might be the potential barriers for you and adjustments you might need when you start working related to travel to, from, and as part of your job, access to and around workplace building or buildings if it's a multi-building organisation or site, attending and participating in meetings, getting instructions and undertaking tasks, communicating, and that might be with your colleagues, with your manager, with customers and other people who you engage with as part of your work, your workspace, and also work patterns and break times. So those are all things to think about, but I'd also like to specifically point out that there can be sometimes health and safety implications for you and for your colleagues and other people you come into contact with in your job. If the nature of your disability or condition means that you might have sudden onset of pretty significant symptoms that are going to considerably impair you as an individual at that point, and where you may need support and help. If you have one of those kind of conditions, then it is really important for your health and safety, and also for other people, that you communicate this with your manager and discuss who needs to know what they need to know, and possibly whether there needs to be a plan in place to support you, whether that's because you suffer losses of consciousness because of epilepsy, maybe asthma attacks, maybe panic attacks. Those are just some examples that come to mind, but there will be other conditions too where you are going to at times need support space, and it's better for everybody, your well-being in particular, that there's a plan and everybody knows what needs to happen. Okay, now who organises and in particular pays for reasonable adjustments to enable you to perform in a workplace varies. There is no, as you will find if you look on the gov.uk website about disability rights, this thing about reasonable adjustments, the word reasonable is there because what's reasonable for a large, well-resourced employer may not be reasonable for a much smaller employer who doesn't have a big HR department and occupational health advisors and a big budget for modifications. So because of this, there's been a scheme created called Access to Work, which is government funded and can, in the case of small and medium-sized employers who are the biggest growth area of the British economy at this time, the Access to Work programme is something that you have to access. The employer doesn't. It would be you as an individual with a disability going into the world of work. You can contact them. They will offer you an advisor and an assessment of your needs in the workplace. And then depending what comes out of that assessment, you may get ongoing support with moving into working life, which can include a non-repayable grant covering the costs of practical support in the workplace. It's a very individualised case-by-case service, so I would strongly advise, if you're in this position, look at the Access to Work information on the gov.uk website and contact them with details of your specific situation. Okay, so I've taken you through in the last hour or so a whole lot of issues to think about, and for you to decide what's your position, what information do you want to share, how do you want to frame the discussion. I am aware that it can be overwhelming. As I said at the beginning, I would suggest if you've stuck with this all the way through for the last hour and 4 minutes without a break, I would suggest that you sit back and reflect and make some notes to yourself of what was relevant to you. You may need to go through stages of the presentation again, and you may find it generates questions that you need to consider further. And there is lots of information and advice, both generally and on an individual basis, available. So do go back and click on those links that were in earlier slides about if you want to talk to me, or if you maybe want to see further information on either the Careers website or the My Plus Students Club website. If there is a disability advocacy organisation for your particular condition, it'd be worth tracking that down. And even if you've already looked at their website, maybe had some contact with them, then do revisit it and see if they do have information and advice for people with your condition in the workplace. That can be very useful. And some of the larger ones, well, and the smaller ones, they do have information and advice lines and chat functions. Use those as well. There is lots of information and advice out there, but it all has to start with you reaching out and asking people that. And please do that. You're not on your own with any of this. And although it can seem a bit overwhelming at the start, once you start to break it down into individual things to find out and think about, it all becomes quite manageable. And it is absolutely in your interests to think it all through, do the research, get your position clear, be able to enter into application and recruitment and selection processes, being very clear about what your needs are and what adjustments are going to help you be successful. Because as a talented individual, as you will be, having become a student of Lancaster University, you have a lot to offer to the world of work, and it's so important, not just for you, but for the economy and for British life and life in many countries and communities, that people with disabilities are offering their talents, abilities and insights in the workplace. So don't allow there to be barriers that didn't need to be there. So I'm going to finish the presentation now. Do please get in touch with me if at any point you feel I can help, and do access other sources that you think are of value to you.